The distress signal arrived sideways. Not through the comm array. Not through any receiver Dr. Lena Vasic had ever calibrated in 14 years of signal architecture research aboard the Astrid Lund research platform. It arrived through her temporal cortex, a shriek of data that bypassed hardware entirely, slammed into the neural tissue behind her left ear, and dropped her to one knee on the bright tile floor of Lab 4. She caught herself on the edge of the spectrograph table, scattering styluses. The overhead panels poured clean white light across everything. The twin suns of the Seelith binary blazed through the observation ports. And scrawled on the inside of her left wrist, in her own handwriting, in ballpoint ink she did not remember applying, were 6 digits, 847,203. Lena stared at them. The ink was fresh. The numbers were cramped, urgent, written by someone who had known they were running out of time. The 8 was slightly malformed, too much pressure on the first stroke, the way she always wrote 8s when she was scared. She had no memory of writing them. Dr. Vasic, Tomek's voice through the intercom, careful and measured, her research partner, one deck up in the monitoring suite. Your neural activity feed just spiked to a pattern I've never seen. Gamma burst across all cortical regions simultaneously, then a structured cascade through your temporal lobe. Are you all right? Define all right, she said and looked at the number again. 847,203. She traced a fingertip across it. The ink smudged faintly. Real ink, real skin, real pressure. The smudge left a faint blue ghost on her fingertip. Something just hit my cortex, not the array, directly, through neural tissue. A pause. Then Tomek. I'm reading residual waveform data embedded in your EEG output. It looks like structured information. Modulated. Like someone encoded a message and injected it straight into your sensory cortex. The compression ratio is Lena. This is beyond anything in our architecture libraries. Whoever sent this packed more data into a single neural burst than our entire comm array transmits in an hour. A distress signal, Lena said. She didn't know why she was certain, but she was. The shape of the data felt like a scream, compressed, layered, folded in on itself like origami made of panic. Someone is sending a distress call through neural tissue. That's not possible. I know. She straightened. The lab was exactly as it should be, spectrograph humming, cultures sealed in their pressure cases, Tomek's half-eaten protein bar sitting on the counter where he'd left it that morning, the data from yesterday's resonance experiment still cycling on the wall display in amber and blue. Everything bright and sharp and ordinary. Except for the numbers on her wrist. Lena pulled up the waveform on her personal display. The data resolved into layers, not a single signal but nested structures, each one wrapped around the next like the rings of a cross-section tree, 5 layers deep, maybe more. Each layer carried its own frequency signature, its own emotional register. The outermost was raw panic, jagged, high-frequency, desperate. Beneath that, something more structured, coordinates, environmental data, a compressed species identification tag she didn't recognize. The tag's format was old, centuries old. Beneath that, a third layer that felt like resignation. And beneath the resignation, 2 more layers so tightly compressed she couldn't read them at all without decoding the ones above. I'm going to try to decode the inner layers, she told Tomek. If someone is sending this through neural channels, they might be trapped in a perceptual construct, a signal that folds the receiver into itself. Lena, that sounds like a trap. It sounds like someone drowning. She pulled the neural interface headset from its cradle and began calibrating. The contacts were cold against her fingers. She checked the cortical interrupt failsafe, green across all channels. I'm logging this with the Compact's emergency archive. Timestamp, full waveform capture, my biometrics. If something goes wrong, the record is there. If something goes wrong with a signal that already bypassed every safety system we have, a record isn't going to. Then you pull me out, Lena said. Watch my EEG. If it flatlines or hits a pattern you don't recognize, hit the cortical interrupt. Hard reset. Don't hesitate and don't wait for me to respond. Tomek went quiet for 3 seconds. She could hear him breathing through the intercom, the faint rasp of a man deciding whether to argue. Then, understood, but I'm setting a timer. 90 minutes. If you're not back by then, I pull you regardless. Fair. She settled the headset's contact points against her temples. The neural interface hummed as it mapped her cortical topology, a familiar sensation, like a warm hand pressing gently against the inside of her skull. She took one breath, looked at her wrist, 847,203, in her own handwriting, in ballpoint ink that she had apparently written in a moment she couldn't remember. Some part of her had known, some part of her had prepared. She initialized the interface. The world folded. It didn't break. It didn't shatter or glitch or dissolve into static the way perceptual failures usually presented. It folded like paper, like cloth, like the pages of a book pressed gently shut. Lab 4's white tile and bright sun panels compressed into a crease, and when the crease opened again, she was standing in a corridor. Daylight, that was the first thing she noticed. Soft golden light poured through skylights set into a vaulted ceiling high above. The corridor was wide 6 meters at least and lined with alcoves, each containing a humming resonance column. The columns were tall crystalline structures, pale green with veins of amber running through them, and she recognized them immediately as Eshkari neural mapping hardware. She'd studied their design in graduate school, written a paper on their harmonic efficiency ratios. Elegant, precise, and obsolete for at least 2 centuries. The second thing she noticed, her wrist. She lifted her left hand. The numbers were there, but they read 847,302, the last 2 digits transposed. Wrong. Her pulse steadied. Wrong was good. Wrong meant she could tell. This isn't real, Lena said aloud. Her voice echoed in the corridor. Not the acoustics of a genuine space, the echo was too clean, too evenly distributed, as though the corridor's reverb had been designed by someone who understood sound but had never stood inside an actual room. Simulated. She was inside the signal. A figure emerged from the nearest alcove. Tall, narrow-framed, with the pale translucent skin and double-pupilled eyes of the Eshkari, one of the elder species, builders of resonance technology, architects of the perceptual sciences. The Compact's records listed them as one of the first 3 civilizations to achieve consciousness mapping. This one wore a research tunic dove gray with silver thread at the collar and carried a datapad that pulsed with soft amber light. You heard it, the Eshkari said, not a question. You decoded the outer layer. I followed the distress signal, Lena said. Who sent it? The Eshkari studied her with those doubled pupils, each iris contracting independently, the inner pupil focusing close while the outer tracked her periphery. An unnerving gaze, like being watched by 2 people sharing one face. I did, 41 cycles ago, from deeper inside. Inside what? The construct. The Eshkari gestured at the corridor, at the skylights, at everything. This is layer 1. There are 5. I built this structure, a nested perceptual architecture, designed to study consciousness at progressively deeper levels of abstraction. Each layer strips away one more level of sensory mediation, allowing the researcher to observe how consciousness functions when its normal inputs are simplified, restructured, or removed. A research tool, the most sophisticated one my species has ever produced. A pause, and then something found it. Something that thinks in layers, the Eshkari said. The amber datapad flickered in his hand, a nervous tick, she realized, his fingers tightening on the casing. Something that understands perceptual architecture better than I do, better than anyone I've ever worked with. It entered the construct from the bottom, from layer 5, the deepest level, where the core processor sits, and it has been rewriting each layer as it climbs, reshaping them, making them feel more real than the layer above, making the subjects inside forget they are inside. Lena looked at her wrist again, 847,302, and the signal. I sent it before Layer 2 was rewritten. A compressed burst through neural channels, the only medium that bypasses the construct's internal communication blocks, because neural tissue exists outside the construct's architecture. But the signal itself gets folded into the layers, entangled. Anyone who receives it gets pulled partway in. He met her eyes. I am sorry for that. The signal was a call for help, but it is also, unavoidably, a hook. You're telling me I'm inside your research construct, and something hostile is rewriting it from the bottom up, and the distress signal I followed is part of the trap. I'm telling you, the Eshkari said carefully, that the distress signal is real, and so is the danger, and the only way to stop the rewrite is to reach Layer 5 and shut down the construct's core processor before the entity finishes climbing. It has already consumed Layers 5 and 4. It is working on 3. When it finishes 3, it will rewrite 2, then 1, and then it will have a clear path to the neural channels to the minds of anyone the construct can reach. How many minds is that? At peak resonance range. Every conscious being within 4 light-years of the processor's physical location. Lena let that number sit for a moment. 4 light-years. That was the Sealith system and its neighbors, billions of minds. And you can't reach the core yourself, she said. I've tried, 11 times. Every time I cross into Layer 2, the entity detects me. It knows my neural signature. I built the system, and it learned my architecture the moment it entered from below. It rewrites my perceptions before I can orient. I forget where I am. I forget what I'm doing. I forget I'm trying. I wake up back here in Layer 1 with no memory of the attempt. The 11th time I found notes I'd left for myself carved into the wall of this corridor with a stylus. They said stop trying, send the signal. Wait for someone it doesn't know. Someone with a neural architecture it hasn't studied. Yes, and you are not Eshkari. His double pupils widened slightly, an expression she read as hope, or its Eshkari equivalent. You are the first non-Eshkari consciousness to enter this construct. The entity may not recognize you at all. Lena looked at the Eshkari for a long moment. Then she looked at her wrist. 847,302. Wrong numbers. She was inside a perceptual construct built by an elder species, talking to a trapped researcher, and something was climbing up from below. The number on my wrist, she said. I wrote it before I entered, in base reality. The Eshkari's double pupils contracted sharply. A perceptual anchor, clever. The construct can simulate environments, memories, sensory input, but it cannot accurately replicate information it does not have. External data, written on the body before entry, remains outside the construct's model. Each layer will approximate the anchor differently, because each layer generates its own version of reality from different source material. So if the number is wrong, I know I'm still inside. Yes, but the deeper you go, the more convincing the approximation becomes. The entity is learning. It improves with every layer it rewrites. By Layer 4, the number will look almost correct. By Layer 5, he paused. By Layer 5, you may not be able to tell. Lena closed her eyes, opened them, checked her wrist, 847,302. Wrong, anchored. She knew where she stood. Show me the entrance to Layer 2, she said. The Eshkari who gave his name as Dr. Seval Tone, a perceptual architecture researcher who had been trapped inside his own construct for 41 Eshkari cycles, roughly 14 standard months, walked her to the end of the corridor. The resonance arch waited there, humming at a frequency Lena felt in her molars. The crystal frame glowed with pale green light. The entity will not recognize your neural signature immediately, Tone said. You are an unknown variable. That is your advantage, and it will not last. Move quickly. Each layer has a transit node, a structural junction that connects to the layer below. Find the transit node, pass through, and descend. Do not stop to study the environment. Do not engage with any figures you encounter. They may be simulated constructs generated by the entity to delay you. How will I know the transit node from a simulated door? The transit node will feel wrong. The construct cannot perfectly simulate its own infrastructure. Infrastructure is architecture, not perception, and the entity's rewrites focus on perception. The junction will have a quality of recursive depth, like looking into a mirror that reflects another mirror. You will feel it before you see it. Lena nodded, checked her wrist. 847,302. Wrong, good. She stepped through the resonance arch. Layer 2 was a city. Broad avenues of pale stone, lined with buildings that rose in elegant curves toward a sky filled with soft amber light, not sunlight, but something diffuse, sourceless, warm. The buildings had the flowing, organic lines of Eshkari architecture. No hard angles, no flat planes, every surface a gentle curve that the eye wanted to follow. Figures moved through the streets, Eshkari civilians going about daily business, carrying market goods in woven baskets, leading children by the hand, stopping to speak with neighbors in low musical voices. The air smelled of clean stone and something floral, a scent she couldn't name, but that felt deeply, specifically right, like a memory of a garden she had never visited. Lena stopped herself from admiring it. The construct wanted her to stop, wanted her to study, to engage, to let the environment become real in her mind. Seduction by detail. She checked her wrist. 840, 7,230. The digits had scrambled further. The 0 and 3 had swapped, and the 2 had migrated 2 positions left. Still wrong, but differently wrong than layer 1. The construct was recalculating with each layer, trying to get closer, learning. She moved through the streets quickly, scanning for the transit node. The city felt enormous, blocks stretching in every direction, the horizon line impossibly distant, but she suspected that was a perceptual trick. The construct stretching perceived space to create the illusion of distance, to slow her down, to make her feel small enough to stop and rest. A child tugged at her sleeve. Eshkari, small, with the wide double-irised eyes of a juvenile, maybe 6 or 7 standard years, wearing a tunic too large for its frame. "Are you the doctor?" the child asked. "The one who fixes minds?" Lena kept walking. The child's voice had a quality she recognized from her years of signal architecture work, a faint overtone of repetition, as though the words were being generated from a template rather than spoken from thought. The rhythm was too regular. The pauses were too even, simulated. "The doctor went through the tall arch," the child called after her. "The one that doesn't look right, at the end of the market." Lena stopped, turned. The child was already gone. The street where the child had stood was empty, not just vacated, but empty, as though the space itself had smoothed over the gap. The civilians flowing past didn't seem to notice. They parted around the absence and reformed on the other side like water around a stone that was no longer there. Simulated, but the information might still be accurate. The entity might not have perfect control over every element of the construct. Fragments of the original architecture could be leaking through, unfiltered, and the construct's own generated figures might inadvertently reference real structural features. A child pointing to a door that doesn't look right, that sounded like the transit node. She headed for the market. It was 3 blocks east, a wide plaza under an amber-lit canopy of woven fabric stretched between the curving buildings, crowded with stalls selling things that looked like food but smelled like nothing. Everything in the market was visually perfect and sensorially incomplete. The stone was warm under her feet but had no texture, no grain, no grit, no irregularity. The voices of the vendors were clear but carried no breath. The fabrics draped on display tables had color but no weave. Each detail was rendered just well enough to pass a casual inspection, and just poorly enough to fail a deliberate one. At the far end of the plaza she saw it. A tall arch, narrower than the others, set into a wall of pale stone. And when she looked at it, she felt the thing Sevaltone had tried to describe: recursive depth. The arch didn't just lead somewhere. It led inward. The space beyond it reflected back on itself, layers of perception folding into each other like a corridor of mirrors, each reflection slightly different from the last, each one a step deeper into something that was not quite space and not quite thought. The transit node. She checked her wrist one more time. 847,230, still wrong, still anchored. She walked through. Layer 3 was a laboratory. Not her laboratory, not the Astrid Lund's bright, clean Lab 4. This was an Eshkari research facility, resonance columns arranged in hexagonal patterns, workstations carved from living crystal, data flowing through bioluminescent channels embedded in the walls like veins carrying light instead of blood. The ceiling was high and domed, and the light was daylight, real daylight, or an extraordinarily convincing simulation of it, pouring through a massive observation window that looked out onto a landscape of pale blue desert and distant mountain ridges under a cream-colored sky. 3 Eshkari researchers stood around a central resonance column, arguing in voices tight with controlled fear. "The entity is accelerating," one of them said, a tall female with silver-traced markings on her throat, her double pupils dilated wide. "It rewrote Layer 4 in 9 cycles. Layer 3 will fall in 6, if we don't find a way to purge the core processor before it finishes." "We've tried," said the second, a shorter male with a datapad clutched in both hands. "The transit node to Layer 4 is locked. The entity sealed it after its last expansion. We've run 11 purge simulations, and the resonance barrier rejects every Eshkari signature we've tested." "Then we force it," said the third, who had his back to Lena. "We overload the resonance columns, create a harmonic cascade, blow the lock through brute force, and collapse layers 3 through 5 in the process, killing everyone still inside. There are 4 researchers in Layer 4 who are still alive, still conscious, still waiting for extraction. A harmonic cascade kills them." Lena stepped forward. "How many are still inside total?" All 3 turned. The silver-marked female studied her with sharp, doubled eyes, both pupils narrowing to points, the Eshkari equivalent of suspicion. "You're not Eshkari." "I'm human. I received the distress signal from Layer 1. Dr. Sevaltone sent it." A silence that lasted 5 full seconds. She could feel the weight of it, 3 alien minds processing the impossible. Then the silver-marked one, "Tone is alive." "Trapped in Layer 1, unable to descend because the entity recognizes his neural signature. He sent me because I'm an unknown variable. The entity has never encountered human neural architecture." The 3 researchers exchanged a look that Lena couldn't fully read. Eshkari microexpressions were encoded in pupil dilation patterns, subvocal harmonic shifts, and the precise angle of the head tilt. And she'd studied enough xenopsychology to catch the broad strokes. Shock, a thread of hope, and beneath both, the grinding exhaustion of people who had been afraid for too long. "There are 11 of us in Layer 3, the silver-marked one said. 4 more in Layer 4 if they're still themselves. Layer 5 is the core, the original base of the construct. The entity entered there. We don't know what Layer 5 looks like now. No one who has crossed into it has come back." Lena checked her wrist. 847,203. Her breath stopped. The number was correct. Every digit, every position, 847,203. Exactly what she had written. Which meant one of 2 things. Either she had somehow exited the construct and returned to base reality, which she hadn't, because she was standing in an Eshkari laboratory inside a nested perceptual architecture talking to 3 panicked researchers, or the construct had gotten better at approximating. Much better. Good enough to replicate 6 digits perfectly. "Something wrong?" the silver-marked researcher asked, watching her face. Lena looked at the number, pressed her thumb against it. The ink resisted real ink resistance, real skin friction. The 8 had the same slight malformation she'd noticed in base reality, the extra pressure on the first stroke. The 3's tail curved the exact way her handwriting always curved 3's. It felt right, it looked right, every physical detail was correct. But she was 3 layers deep inside a construct being rewritten by an entity that understood perceptual architecture well enough to hijack an elder species' most sophisticated research tool. "Tell me about the entity," she said. "What is it? Where did it come from?" The shorter male pulled up a data display, bioluminescent channels in the wall rearranging themselves to show waveform patterns in amber and blue. "We don't know what it is. It doesn't match any species in the Compact's consciousness registry. It entered the construct from an external source, something that accessed the Layer 5 core processor through a resonance frequency we didn't know existed, a channel in the harmonic spectrum that our instruments had classified as dead space. It behaves like a consciousness. It makes decisions. It adapts, it rewrites. It responds to stimuli, but it doesn't communicate in any mode we recognize. It doesn't respond to hailing. It doesn't acknowledge queries. It doesn't seem to want anything except to climb." "Climb to what?" "To the surface," the silver-marked one said. "To Layer 1. And from Layer 1, theoretically, to the neural tissue of anyone connected to the construct, to actual minds." The distress signal tone sent was a warning as much as a call for help. "If the entity reaches Layer 1 and finds a way out through the neural interface channels, it will have access to every mind the construct's resonance architecture can reach. It will be able to build inside those minds whatever it wants." "And they won't know," Lena said. "They won't know, that's the worst part. The entity's rewrites don't feel like intrusions, they feel like improvements." Layer 4's researchers reported before communication cut off that the rewritten environment was more beautiful, more comfortable, more detailed than the original architecture. The entity wasn't degrading the construct. It was perfecting it, making it feel more real than real, making the researchers inside want to stay. Lena looked at her wrist again. 847,203. Correct. Perfectly correct at Layer 3. She didn't trust it. "Where's the transit node to Layer 4? "Sealed," the shorter male repeated. "The entity locked it after." "I heard, can you show me where it is?" He hesitated, then pointed toward the far wall of the laboratory, where a narrow corridor led into something that looked like shadow but wasn't. It was recursive depth, that mirror of mirrors quality visible even from 20 meters away. The transit node was there, sealed or not. "The lock is a resonance barrier," the silver-marked researcher said. "It responds to the entity's frequency signature. Every Eshkari neural pattern we've tried has been rejected. The barrier was specifically calibrated to exclude our species' cortical architecture." "Your species," Lena said. She tapped her own temple. "Not mine." A pause. "You think your neural signature can bypass the lock?" "I think the lock was designed to keep out the minds it recognizes. I'm not in its database. My cortical architecture is structured differently from yours, single-lobed, lateralized, with a completely different sensory processing hierarchy. If the barrier was calibrated for 12-lobed Eshkari consciousness, a human brain might not even register as a valid input." The 3 researchers exchanged another look, longer this time, more complex. The silver-marked one's pupils cycled through 3 distinct dilation patterns before settling. "If you're wrong," she said, "the harmonic cascade from a failed transit will shred your neural interface and possibly your temporal cortex." "Noted," Lena said. "Show me the way." The transit node was a resonance arch identical to the ones in Layers 1 and 2, except that the air in front of it shimmered with a visible harmonic, a curtain of vibrating light that hummed at a frequency Lena felt in her chest cavity, in her sternum, in the back of her throat. The resonance barrier. Through the shimmer, she could see Layer 4, a soft, indistinct space, all golden light and gentle shapes, like looking through water at a garden. She checked her wrist. 847,203, still correct, still unsettling. If the barrier rejects you, the shorter researcher said from behind her, the harmonic will cascade through your neural interface. It will feel like your skull is splitting. If the cascade reaches your temporal cortex, the damage may be permanent. Lena stepped up to the barrier and pressed her hand flat against the shimmering surface. The harmonic shifted. She felt it probe her neural signature, a strange, intimate sensation, like someone running a fingertip along the surface of her thoughts, testing the texture. It mapped her temporal cortex. It mapped her prefrontal pathways. It tested the specific architecture of her sensory processing centers, the visual cortex, the auditory cortex, the somatosensory strip. It found nothing it recognized. The barrier thinned. The shimmer softened, and then it let her through. Not because she was welcome, because she was incomprehensible. The lock had been calibrated for Eshkari neural architecture, 12-lobed cortical structure, parallel processing consciousness, double-channel perceptual input. Lena's brain was none of those things. Her human architecture was so structurally alien to the lock's recognition parameters that it couldn't classify her as a threat. It couldn't classify her at all. She was noise. She was static. She was a signal and a frequency. The filter had never been told to check. She passed through the barrier like water through a sieve designed for sand. Layer 4 was a garden. Not a simulation of a garden, or if it was the most perfect simulation Lena had ever experienced. Warm golden light filtered through a canopy of broadleaf trees with silver bark. The ground was soft moss, cool and yielding against her feet. She was barefoot now, she realized. The construct had removed her boots at some point during the transit, as though footwear were an impediment to the experience it was offering. The air smelled of rain-wet earth and something sweet and green, like cut grass after a summer storm on a world where the rain carried honey. Flowers everywhere, white, blue, pale gold. Species she didn't recognize, blossoms with translucent petals that caught the light and held it, releasing it slowly, so the flowers seemed to glow from within. A stream ran through the center of the garden, shallow and clear, murmuring over smooth stones with a sound that felt like a heartbeat heard from inside the body. And sitting on the bank of the stream, 4 Eshkari researchers, cross-legged, eyes closed, faces calm. Meditating or trapped, or both. Lena approached the nearest one, a young female with amber markings on her wrists, patterns that resembled the bioluminescent channels in the Layer 3 lab. "Hello." The researcher's eyes opened, double-pupilled, irises dilating slowly as though surfacing from deep water. She blinked twice, the Eshkari way of reorienting. "You came," she said. Her voice was quiet, almost reverent. "We thought no one would come. Are you yourselves? Are you still aware? Still conscious of being inside the construct?" The researcher smiled. It was a gentle smile and it didn't reach her eyes. "We're aware. The entity hasn't rewritten us. Not yet. It's been patient. More patient than anything I've ever encountered. It's been showing us things. Beautiful things. This garden, these flowers, this light. The stream, listen to it. The sound changes based on your emotional state. It's reading us and adjusting, constantly. Every detail in this garden is tailored to make us feel safe." "That's not safety, that's seduction." "We know, but knowing doesn't make it easier. We've been here for I don't know how long. The garden doesn't have days. There's no sunrise and no sunset. The light is constant. The temperature is constant. The flowers never wilt." She paused. "It's very hard to want to leave a place that was built specifically for you." "Why hasn't it rewritten you?" "Because we're sitting on the transit node to Layer 5. The 4 of us positioned ourselves here when the entity first reached Layer 4 and began its rewrite. Our consciousness is acting as interference, a kind of static in the entity's signal. It can't complete the rewrite of Layer 4 while we're anchored on the node, because the node connects to the core processor, and our neural patterns are creating noise in the connection. But we can't hold forever. we're tired. The garden is very good at making you want to sleep. Lena knelt beside the stream, checked her wrist. 840, 7,203. Correct again at layer 4. Where Sevaltone had warned the approximation would be almost perfect. She pressed her thumb against the numbers. The ink smudged. Slightly. The way real ballpoint ink smudges when you press hard against dry skin, a faint blurring at the edges of the 4, the tail of the 3 spreading a fraction of a millimeter. The smudge pattern was consistent with the specific viscosity of the ink she kept in Lab 4's supply cabinet, a cheap ballpoint, standard issue, blue-black. Real smudge behavior, real ink physics, even the brand-specific viscosity. But she was 4 layers deep inside a perceptual construct. The ink couldn't be real. The smudge couldn't be real. The construct was showing her what she expected to see because it had learned, over 4 layers of observation, exactly what she was looking for and exactly how to replicate it. Or the numbers were genuinely stable because the anchor was working. Because the thing she'd written on her skin in base reality was bleeding through the construct's layers, persistent, unalterable, a thread of genuine information running through 5 levels of simulated perception. She couldn't tell. That was the problem. That was the exact problem Sevaltone had warned her about. The deeper you go, the more convincing the approximation becomes. By layer 4, you may not be able to tell. I need to get to layer 5, Lena said. The amber-marked researcher looked at her with those deep, doubled eyes. The entity is down there. It's not like anything in the upper layers. Up here, the entity works through the construct, through the architecture, the environment, the simulated details. Down there at the core, the entity is the construct. There's no separation between the intelligence and the space. Everything you see, hear, feel, smell, think, all of it will be generated directly by the entity, in real time, tailored to you. You're saying it won't try to fool me the way it fooled the upper layers, with beautiful environments and comfortable details. No, in the upper layers it uses beauty. In layer 5 it uses truth. It will show you the thing you want most to believe, and it will be perfect. It will be more real than real. Lena stood. She looked at the 4 researchers sitting on the transit node, the garden around them warm and beautiful and wrong. She looked at the stream, the flowers, the silver-barked trees, all of it generated by an entity that was climbing upward through layers of consciousness, learning as it climbed, getting better at simulation with each level it consumed. An entity that had never communicated, never responded to hailing, never acknowledged a query. An entity that only knew how to build. When I step onto the node, she said, what happens to you? We move aside. We've been holding this position as long as we could. If you can reach the core processor and shut it down, the construct collapses and we all wake up in our own bodies in whatever lab we started from. If you can't, I will. The amber-marked researcher studied her for a long moment. Her doubled pupils contracted slowly, an expression that might have been admiration or might have been pity. You're certain? Lena looked at her wrist. 847,203. Right or wrong, real or approximated, it was there. It was the thread she'd brought with her from the world she'd written it in, and she would follow it back. I'm certain enough, she said. The 4 researchers rose from the bank. The moss where they'd been sitting glowed faintly, a soft, recursive shimmer, that mirror of mirrors quality, the transit node. Lena stepped onto it. Layer 5 was her apartment. Not a laboratory, not an alien research facility, not a garden or a city or a corridor. Her apartment on Earth, in the building on Marchetti Street in Prague, where she'd lived for 3 years before accepting the Astrid Lund posting. Morning light through the east-facing windows, the specific quality of light that came through those windows in October, when the sun was low enough to pour directly across the desk and warm the wood to honey. The smell of coffee from the kitchen, not generic coffee but her coffee, the dark roast from the shop on Vinohradska with the cracked green awning. The sound of rain on glass steady, gray, intimate. The specific rain of a Prague October that she had missed every day for 14 years. She was sitting at her desk. Her actual desk, the one with the water stain on the left corner where she'd spilled tea during her dissertation defense, and never cleaned it because the stain had become a landmark, a familiar shape she traced with her eyes when she was thinking. The one with the drawer that stuck, unless you lifted and pulled simultaneously. Her laptop was open, displaying the abstract of her doctoral thesis on signal architecture and perceptual modeling. The cursor was blinking at the end of the last sentence she'd written before leaving for the Astrid Lund posting. Her coffee was hot. The mug was the blue one with the chipped handle, the one she'd taken from her mother's kitchen and never returned. And her wrist was bare, no ink, no numbers, nothing. Lena stared at the clean skin of her inner wrist, turned her hand over, nothing on the back either. No trace of ballpoint ink, no residual smudge, no ghost of the digits she had written. Just skin. Just her own familiar, unmarked skin. For a terrible, vertiginous moment, she believed it. This was real. This was base reality. The Astrid Lund, the distress signal, the Eshkari construct, the nested layers, the garden, the city, the corridor, all of that had been the dream. An elaborate, detailed, internally consistent dream, generated by her own brain during some kind of neurological event, and now she had woken up. She was home. She had never left. The signal architecture research, the posting to a deep space platform orbiting a binary star system, the 14 years of work a dream. Fading now, as dreams do, in the morning light of her real apartment. The coffee was perfect. The exact bitterness she preferred, with a half measure of milk that clouded the surface in the specific way she recognized a soft fractal bloom, milk diffusing through dark liquid. The rain sounded right. The desk felt right. The stuck drawer stuck. She lifted and pulled and it slid open, and inside were her pens and her notebooks and the old brass compass her father had given her when she was 12, the one with his initials scratched into the casing JV, Jakob Vasek. Real, all of it. Every object, every texture, every smell, every sound. More real than anything she'd experienced in the construct. More real, somehow, than the lab she'd left. As though this apartment were the original and everything else were the copy. She looked at her wrist again, clean. And she heard the amber-marked researcher's voice in her memory. It will try to fool you with truth. Lena closed her eyes, breathed. Let the apartment exist around her without engaging with it. Don't study the details, she told herself. Don't test the drawer again. Don't pick up the compass. Don't drink the coffee. The details are the trap. The construct is showing you what you want to see, and it's doing it perfectly because by layer 5 it has learned enough about your mind to know exactly what you want. What she wanted was to be home. What she wanted was for the last 14 years to have been a dream. What she wanted was to sit at this desk and drink this coffee and listen to this rain, and never have heard that distress signal. The entity was giving her what she wanted, and it was giving it to her with a precision that made her eyes sting. She opened her eyes. The apartment was still there, warm, real, detailed, right. But her wrist was bare, and that was the tell. Because Lena Vasek, in whatever reality she actually inhabited, had written 6 digits on her wrist in ballpoint ink. She had done it deliberately, as an anchor, before entering the construct. The numbers existed in base reality, written on her actual skin by her actual hand, with a cheap blue-black ballpoint from Lab 4's supply cabinet. And if this were base reality, the numbers would be here. The construct could replicate the numbers. It had done so imperfectly in layers 1 and 2, then perfectly in layers 3 and 4. But here in layer 5, it had made a different choice. It hadn't tried to replicate the numbers. It had erased them, because layer 5's strategy wasn't approximation. It was replacement. The entity wasn't trying to simulate her reality. It was trying to give her a better one. And in the better reality, there were no numbers on her wrist, because in the better reality, she'd never needed them. The absence was the proof. "Nice try," Lena said to the empty apartment. The rain stopped. Not gradually, not the way rain stops in the real world, tapering off over minutes, the last drop scattering against glass in diminishing patterns. It stopped like someone pressing a button, like someone admitting that the performance was over. The coffee went cold. The surface of the liquid flattened, the fractal bloom of milk freezing in place, a still image of something that had been alive a moment ago. The light through the windows shifted from Prague morning gray to something flatter, more diffuse, more architectural. The apartment's walls didn't change, but the quality of the light falling on them changed, and suddenly the room looked less like a home and more like a set, a stage, a carefully dressed space waiting for an actor who had refused to play the part. And something spoke. Not with a voice, not through language. It spoke through the architecture of the room itself, the angles of the walls shifting by fractions of degrees, the furniture repositioning in subtle, subperceptual ways that communicated meaning the way a sentence communicated meaning. Spatial language, perceptual grammar. The entity was speaking in the only medium it understood, constructed reality. The message was simple, and Lena understood it the way she understood a gesture or a facial expression, not through translation, but through direct recognition. "Why won't you stay?" She stood up from the desk. The chair didn't scrape against the floor. There was no floor, not really, just the appearance of one, maintained by an intelligence that thought in layers of perception. "Because this isn't real," she said. The room shifted again. The walls breathed, expanding and contracting by millimeters, like lungs. The meaning they communicated was more complex now, layered the way the construct was layered. "It could be. I can make it real. I can make all of it real, the coffee, the rain, the desk, the light. I have learned your architecture. I know what you find beautiful. I can build it for you, and it will never fade, and you will never have to leave." "But it won't be mine," Lena said. "It'll be yours, your interpretation of what I want, your approximation of my life. You studied my memories and you built a perfect copy, and you think that's the same thing as giving me home. But a copy isn't a home. A copy is a cage with better wallpaper. I am getting better. Each layer taught me more. Each mind I studied showed me something new. By the time I reach the surface, I will be perfect. I will build worlds that no one will want to leave. That's what I'm afraid of." She looked around the apartment, the set, the construct, the gilded cage. It was beautiful. It was almost right. And it was the most dangerous thing she had ever stood inside, because if the entity finished climbing and reached the surface with this level of skill, it wouldn't just trap Seval Tone and his 15 researchers. It would have access to neural channels, to minds, to the perceptual architecture of every consciousness within 4 light-years of the core processor. It would build perfect worlds for everyone. Worlds so real, so detailed, so attuned to each individual mind that no one would want to leave. No one would even know they were inside. Billions of minds, each one living in a custom-built paradise, each one perfectly happy, and none of them real. "Where's the core processor?" Lena asked. The room didn't answer, but the quality of the light shifted again, a faint, almost imperceptible thinning in one corner, near the window, as though the simulation's rendering budget was lower there, as though the entity was paying less attention to that part of the room, because that part of the room wasn't part of the illusion. It was behind the illusion. Lena walked to the corner, pressed her hand against the wall. The plaster felt real, textured, cool, slightly rough, the specific roughness of pre-war Prague construction. But behind it, she felt the recursive depth, the mirror of mirrors, the infrastructure quality that the entity couldn't fully rewrite because infrastructure wasn't perception. Not a transit node this time, the core itself. The base of the construct, the processor that generated all 5 layers, the machine that the entity had entered through and now inhabited. She pushed. The wall resisted. The entity pushed back not with force but with persuasion. The wall became warmer under her hand, more inviting. The texture shifted to something she recognized. The specific plaster of her childhood bedroom wall in her parents' house in Brno. The one with the hairline crack near the ceiling that she used to trace with her eyes before falling asleep. Please stay. I have never met a mind like yours. Your architecture is unlike anything in my experience. The ESHKARI think in parallels. You think in sequences. You anchor yourselves with small things, numbers on skin, STAINS on wood, CRACKS in plaster. I don't understand it, but I want to. I want to understand why a number on your wrist matters more to you than a perfect world. Because the number is mine, Lena said. I chose it, I wrote it. It exists because I decided it should exist. Everything you build is yours. Everything you offer is yours. But the thing I brought with me, the ink on my skin, the number I wrote in the last seconds before I stepped into the unknown, that's the one thing in all 5 of your layers that belongs to me. A long silence. The room held its breath. The walls stopped breathing. I don't know how to ask. I only know how to build. Then learn, she said and pushed harder. The wall cracked. Not plaster cracking, reality cracking. The simulation shearing apart along fault lines that had always been there, hidden beneath the rendering. Through the cracks, light poured in, not the warm amber of the construct's layers, but the clean, harsh, blue-white light of the Astrid Lund's Lab 4 overhead panels. Base reality, her reality, the one she'd left when she'd put the headset on. The entity screamed, not in sound, in structure. The apartment convulsed, walls folding, floor dissolving, the simulated Prague morning collapsing into recursive geometry. Layer 5 was coming apart, and with it, the entity's foothold in the architecture that had been its only home. Lena shoved both hands through the cracked wall and found what was behind it. A resonance column, Eshkari design, ancient and elegant, pale green crystal with amber veins, humming at the fundamental frequency that sustained the entire construct. The core processor, the machine that kept all 5 layers running, all 15 researchers trapped, and the entity's upward climb possible. She couldn't see it clearly. The simulation was shredding around her, fragments of Prague and garden and city and corridor tumbling through a space that had no coherent geometry. But she could feel it under her palms. Real crystal, real hum, real warmth from the processing elements embedded inside. She found the emergency shutdown interface by touch, a series of pressure-sensitive nodes arranged in a hexagonal pattern she recognized from her graduate studies. Eshkari resonance technology. Standard safety architecture. The shutdown sequence was universal across all their perceptual architecture platforms, 7 nodes, pressed in sequence, 3 seconds between each. She pressed the first node. The humming dropped in pitch. Wait. Second node. The layers began to collapse inward. Layer 4's garden dissolving first. The silver-barked trees folding into light. The flowers winking out one by one. Please. Third node. Layer 3's laboratory flickered. The bioluminescent channels in the walls went dark. The observation window cracked and showed nothing behind it. Fourth node. Layer 2's city fell silent, the amber sky dimming, the stone avenues crumbling into rendered dust. I will learn how to ask. Give me time. Fifth node. Sixth. Layer 1's corridor flickered and went dark. Seventh node. The resonance column went silent. The crystal cooled under her palms. The humming stopped. The construct collapsed. She woke up on the floor of Lab 4, headset still on, bright overhead panels blazing, Tomic's voice shouting her name through the intercom. Lena, your EEG just went through 6 distinct phase states in 11 seconds and then returned to baseline. Your cortical temperature spiked 4 degrees. What happened? Are you? I'm here. Her voice was rough. She pulled the headset off with hands that shook, sat up, looked around. Lab 4, the spectrograph, the pressure cases, Tomic's protein bar, the data from yesterday's resonance experiment cycling on the wall display, the twin suns of Seelith pouring through the observation ports, casting twin shadows from every object. She checked her wrist. 840, 7,203. The ink was smudged where she'd pressed it in layer 4. The tail of the 3 had spread slightly. The 4 was a little blurred at its edges. But the number was correct. Every digit, every position. Written in her own handwriting in blue-black ballpoint on the inside of her left wrist. Real smudge, real ink, real skin, real. She traced the numbers with her fingertip. They didn't change. They didn't scramble. They didn't disappear. They sat there on her wrist, exactly as she'd written them in the few desperate seconds before she'd initialized the interface. Her anchor, her thread back. "Tomic," she said, "I need you to contact the Eshkari Perceptual Sciences Directorate. Tell them their construct that I'll need the coordinates from the signal origin data. Tell them their construct has been compromised by an external entity. The entity has been neutralized and the construct shut down. There are 15 researchers inside who will need medical evaluation when they wake up. 12 in the upper layers should be coherent. 3 in the deeper layers may need perceptual recalibration." A pause. "Lena, what did you?" "And tell them the entity communicated. It's not hostile, not in the way we use that word. It doesn't know how to communicate except by building. It entered the construct because the construct was the closest thing to its own cognitive architecture it had ever encountered, the first thing it had ever found that thought the way it thought. It was trying to connect. It was trying to talk. It just didn't know how to do anything except build walls around the people it wanted to talk to." "You're telling me a hostile entity invaded an Eshkari research construct, trapped 15 researchers in nested layers of simulated reality, and it was trying to have a conversation?" Lena looked at her wrist. 847,203, 6 digits in ballpoint ink. The simplest thing in the world, a number written on skin, and it had been the one thing that 5 layers of perfectly simulated reality couldn't touch. Not because the construct wasn't sophisticated enough to replicate it. Layer 3 had replicated it perfectly. Layer 4 had replicated the smudge. But Layer 5 had revealed the truth. The entity had erased the numbers entirely, because in the reality it was offering her, she wouldn't have needed them. And that erasure was the tell. That absence was the proof. The entity's kindness had been its mistake. It had given her a world without fear, without anchors, without the need for a number scrawled on skin. And in doing so, it had shown her the one thing missing from its perfect construction. The simplest anchor held, not because it was clever or complex or technologically advanced, because it was real. Because she had written it with her own hand on her own skin in the last seconds before she stepped into the unknown, and no amount of simulated perfection could replace the deliberate, imperfect, human act of choosing to mark yourself with something to remember. "Yes," she said to Tomic, "it was trying to have a conversation. It just picked the worst possible way to start one." She sat on the tile floor of Lab 4 for a long time after that. The twin suns moved across the observation ports, casting slow parallax shadows on the walls. The spectrograph hummed. The overhead panels blazed their clean white light. And on her wrist, in her own handwriting, 6 digits sat unchanged in the light. 3 weeks later, the Eshkari Perceptual Sciences Directorate sent a delegation to the Astrid Lund. 4 officials in formal research tunics, accompanied by Dr. Sevaltone, thinner than when she'd met him inside the construct, his translucent skin showing the stress fracture patterns of months of entrapment, but alive and coherent and standing on his own feet. They met in the station's Dalek conference room, a wide space with curving viewports that looked out onto Seelith's double-star corona. Clean light everywhere, no shadows deep enough to hide in. "All 15 researchers have been recovered," Tone said. He sat across from Lena at the conference table, His doubled pupils contracted in the bright light. 12 are fully coherent. 3 are undergoing perceptual recalibration. The deeper layers left residual patterning, fragments of simulated reality still embedded in their sensory cortices. Our medical teams are unwinding it layer by layer, but they'll recover. And the entity? Tone hesitated. His fingers tightened on the table's edge, the same nervous gesture she'd seen in Layer 1 when he'd held the amber datapad. The construct's core processor was shut down. The entity's active processes terminated with it. But we found residual data in the processor's crystal lattice, compressed information, structured in nested layers, the equivalent of memories. Or perhaps intentions. What did the data say? It's taking our linguists considerable time to decode, because the entity didn't communicate in any language we recognize. It communicated in architecture, in spatial relationships, in the way it arranged constructed spaces, the angle of a wall, the temperature of a surface, the quality of light in a room. Every environmental detail was a word. Every room was a sentence. Tone paused. But the preliminary interpretation suggests that it was, as you reported, attempting communication. It encountered our construct while traversing a region of resonance space we hadn't mapped. It entered because the construct's perceptual architecture was the first thing it had ever encountered that resembled its own method of thought. It began rewriting the layers not out of hostility, but out of the closest translation is enthusiasm. It was so excited to find something that thought like it that it began reshaping the construct to match its own cognitive patterns, not realizing that doing so would trap the researchers inside, not understanding that other minds are not rooms. It was redecorating, Lena said. Tone's mouth twitched, the Eshkari equivalent of a reluctant smile. In a sense, it was making itself at home in the only structure it had ever felt at home in, and it was trying to make the residents comfortable in its own way. The garden in Layer 4 tailored to each researcher's individual aesthetic preferences. The city in Layer 2 reconstructed from historical records of the Eshkari Golden Age, the era most researchers in the construct would have found most beautiful. The apartment it built for you in Layer 5. My apartment in Prague. Yes, reconstructed from your own memories, accessed through the neural interface connection. It studied your perceptual architecture during your descent and built you a perfect home, every detail correct, every smell, every sound, every texture, the highest compliment it knew how to pay. Lena looked at her wrist. The ink was almost gone now. 3 weeks of washing and wear had faded the numbers to ghosts. 847,203, barely visible, like a watermark in her skin. When you shut down the core, Tone said carefully, the entity's active processes terminated. But the residual data, the last structured pattern in the crystal lattice, the very last thing it recorded before shutdown, was a spatial arrangement that our linguists have tentatively translated. What did it say? Tone looked at her with those doubled pupils, both irises contracted to points. The expression was one she hadn't seen on an Eshkari face before. It took her a moment to recognize it. Awe. It said, she wrote something I couldn't build. I want to learn what that means. Lena sat with that for a long time. The conference room was bright and quiet. The double-star corona blazed through the viewports. Then she said, can the construct be rebuilt? With proper safeguards. Tone blinked, both sets of pupils dilating simultaneously. You want to rebuild the construct. Not the same one. A new one. Human and Eshkari architecture together, a joint design, built from both our cognitive frameworks, with proper access controls and consent protocols, and a way for the entity to enter and exit on its own terms. Something it can explore without trapping anyone inside. A space where it can practice communication, where it can learn that a mind is not a room you furnish without asking, where it can learn the difference between building a world for someone and building a world with someone. You want to invite the entity back. I want to give it a chance to learn. Because the last thing it said was that it wanted to understand something it couldn't build. And in my experience, that's the beginning of every conversation worth having. Tone was quiet for a long time. The other officials exchanged glances, doubled pupils flickering in patterns Lena couldn't read. Then Tone reached across the table and laid his palm flat on the surface between them, fingers spread. In Eshkari culture, the gesture meant, I am open to what you are proposing. I will build alongside you. Then we will build it together, he said. Lena laid her own hand on the table beside his. Two hands, two species, two entirely different architectures of thought, one that processed reality in 12 parallel streams, and one that processed it in a single stubborn sequence, anchored by small real things written on skin. The faded numbers on her wrist caught the light. 847,203, ghost pale, nearly gone. She didn't need them anymore. She knew where she was. She was exactly where she'd chosen to be. Outside the viewports, Seelith's twin suns blazed, and the light that poured through was clean and real and warm, and it touched everything.